Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to Is Brexit Done? The latest webinar from Atticus Communications. I'm James Frith, former Member of Parliament for Bury North and now Senior Counsel for Atticus, and your host today. Atticus Communications is a full-service communications, strategic and government affairs consultancy. We discuss the pressing and topical issues with our clients and on their behalf. And today, we're doing precisely that. We've a stellar lineup and a great range of views and experiences to tap into. Our four distinguished guest speakers, who will begin shortly with their opening remarks, speaking to the subject, Is Brexit Done?, for 3 minutes before we enjoy their conversation, which I shall chair. And we want to hear from you. Please send your questions direct to me, but the chat is also open for comments. I'm not sure there is such a thing as post-Brexit. Brexit is a process, not an event. We've left the EU, but when will we stop living with Brexit? We've a shrinking economy, but how will we know what is COVID and what is from Brexit? The huge success of the vaccine rollout strengthens the argument Brexiteers have made about the UK being a nimble-footed sovereign decision maker, but try telling the fishermen and cheesemakers that their lives just got better. Britain's deal with the EU took just 11 months to get, not 7 years like Canada. But we need multiple trade deals the size of America to match the size of access to the single market. Brexiteers still overwhelmingly defend the union of our United Kingdom, but in Scotland, Brexit is a recruiting sergeant for an independent Scotland. And so the debate continues, and so it is important we continue to discuss it. Ladies and gentlemen, our first speaker is the Right Honourable Lord Gavin Barwell. Gavin had a front row seat for Parliament's repeated attempts to get Brexit done. A former MP himself before becoming Chief of Staff to the then Prime Minister, Theresa May. Gavin, welcome. Could I invite you to make your opening remarks, please?
Thanks, James. Pleasure to be with you today, and good to see some old friends among the people on the webinar. Look, I'm going to keep it very short. I think there are 4 ways of answering your question. 2 tell you it is done, and 2 tell you it isn't. So, starting point is the simplistic legal question: we have left the European Union, and in that narrow legal sense, Brexit is clearly and unambiguously done. Second test, I think, is the court of public opinion. And I think if you look at polls at the extent to which this is a major issue for voters, that would tell you that as far as the electorate is concerned, the issue is done, the decision is made, we've moved on, and people are focused on other issues. The 2 senses in which I would argue it's not done are we done negotiating with the EU? If anyone has taken the time to read, as I have, the 1,200 odd page deal that we signed with the EU on Christmas Eve, it is full of specialised committees that are going to carry on talking about bits of the relationship. It's got a review clause. There was a declaration alongside it committing to further negotiations on a number of other issues like financial services. So we've basically turned ourselves into Switzerland, and we're going to be more or less in permanent negotiation with the EU at official level going forward. And then the final and probably most important test, which is probably why we're having this discussion today, is whether or not the people of this country ultimately will see this relationship with the EU as a final resting point, and whether the politicians will. And I think that the jury is still out on that. We'll have to wait and see how it develops. But I'll end with one sort of provocative thought in an attempt to encourage debate. It seems to me that there are 2 Boris Johnsons. One Boris Johnson wants us to move on, wants us all to go back to loving him like we did when he was Mayor of London and talking about other things. And the other Boris Johnson wants to use this issue at the next election against the Labour Party in the red wall seats. So a lot will depend on the Conservative Party itself, whether it wishes to continue fighting this battle because it thinks it's in its electoral interest to do so, or whether it wants to move on. I'll stop there.
Thank you, Gavin. Our next speaker, Professor Matthew Goodwin, is an academic and best-selling writer. He wrote the first academic book on the Brexit vote and wrote with acute accuracy, painful in my case, on the threat that UKIP posed the Labour Party. Matthew, welcome. If you could make your opening remarks, please.
Yes, thank you very much. Good afternoon to everybody. I wanted to focus mainly on domestic party politics and ask whether Brexit really is done. And to build on your comments at the outset, I think we can certainly view Brexit as a process. I think we can also view Brexit as a symptom. And if you look at the polls today, and one of the things I spend far too much time doing is looking at the data within the polls, we can see that even today, the Conservative Party has about a 15-point lead over the Labour Party among the working class, is holding a significant lead over the Labour Party among non-graduates, people without degrees, and also among low-income voters. That to me is a sign of the broader realignment that is taking place within British politics, of which Brexit was the most visible expression. There have basically been three acts that have reshaped British politics over the last decade. The rise of populism, the vote for Brexit, and then the ascendancy of Boris Johnson and the 2019 election that brought all of that together. And I think it's tempting to say that now that Brexit has been formalised and the salience of that issue is declining in the polls, that therefore we're going to revert to normal. I actually don't think that's the case. I think there is a growing consensus in political science that not only in Britain, but across most, if not all Western democracies, we are entering into, if you like, a second phase in democratic politics. The traditional left versus right economic divide is now making way for what we might call a liberal conservative divide over culture and identity. And we can see that playing out through a whole host of other debates. For example, the sharp divide between Remainers and Leavers on how they think about the royal family, how they think about migration, how they think about freedom and political correctness, and all of those types of issues, which are giving new expression to this deeper culture divide that is now entrenched within our politics. So my opening statement really is to say that whatever happens from here on in terms of the relationship between the UK and the EU, I think here, as in other democracies, from the US to the Netherlands yesterday, where this new cultural cleavage was confirmed with the election results between anti-EU and pro-EU parties, I think the underlying fault line that gave rise to Brexit is going to be with us for a long time to come.
Thank you, Matthew. Our next speaker is the Chief Executive of Best for Britain, Naomi Smith. Best for Britain is a civic society campaign organisation founded by Gina Miller to stop Brexit. Under Naomi's leadership, Best for Britain joined forces with the People's Vote campaign and led the campaign for a final say on the Brexit vote. Naomi also co-hosts podcasts Oh God, What Now?, formerly The Remainiacs, and The Bunker. Naomi, welcome.
Thank you very much, and it's great to be here. So ever the SWOT, I wanted to try and answer the exam question, is Brexit done? And when I ask that question, I just sort of get reminded of children in the back of the car saying, are we there yet? If you have to ask the question, then your journey is almost certainly not complete. And in fact, the journey is really only beginning as Britain and the EU square up over issues ranging from Northern Ireland to COVID vaccines, as we've seen this week. And, breaking stuff is easy. Putting it back together requires a lot more than just sort of slogans and sophistry. And so if you want to know how done Brexit is, there are lots of different people we need to ask. Ask a young person. Ask them about Erasmus and the pound shop replacement of the Turing scheme. Ask them about travel and work opportunities, whether they can still work as a club rep in Ibiza or a hairdresser in Marbella. Ask them about who's going to pay most dearly for our European divorce. And, hint, it's not those generations that have benefited most from EU membership and then decided to jump ship. If you want to know how done Brexit is, you could ask an exporter or a haulier, ask them about red tape, border friction, all the new costs that they're having to incur, and who is ultimately going to pay for those costs as they get passed on down the supply chain. Ask them if they think Brexit and the EU could perhaps have some work to do in the years ahead to undo some of that damage that's been caused by this fairly hard Brexit. If you want to know how done Brexit is, you could ask a Scottish person, a Northern Irish person, even a Welsh person, ask them what impact Brexit is having on the Union. Ask them if Brexit has improved relations between Westminster and the devolved nations. Ask them if they think that the UK is now more fractured than it was before, if there's long-term work to be done, regardless of whether you're a unionist or a separatist. Ask someone like me, who grew up in Northern Ireland during the height of the Troubles, whether they fear that the only thing that brought a lasting peace to the frozen conflict there, the Good Friday Agreement, is under threat. Indeed, ask an American the same question, whether Republican or Democrat. If you want to know how done Brexit is, find someone who can point to a genuine benefit of the divorce. Ask them if they're kind of feeling okay, because there really haven't been any genuine benefits from Brexit yet, not economically, diplomatically, or socially. And not even in terms of COVID. You know, Britain didn't have to leave the EU to have control over its own vaccine policies. It didn't have to leave the EU to control its own borders, as the pandemic has made abundantly clear. And if we're going to find some advantages to Brexit, I think we're going to be doing it for years to come. So as the others have said, technically Brexit happened 15 months or so ago. But much like chewing your own leg off, you might have completed the part that involves all of the screaming, but you're going to be dealing with the consequences until you find a decent prosthetic. Everything has now changed, and so much of everything that we do is going to be seen through a Brexit lens, whether we like that or not. And so in that respect, Brexit, I'm afraid, will not be done for a very, very long time indeed.
Thank you, Naomi. Writer and Professor Anand Menon was our lecturer at European politics, was lecturer in European politics, sorry, at Oxford University for 10 years. And for 5 of those, he was a fellow. He is director of UK in a Changing Europe. Anand, welcome.
Thanks, James. Just to sort of try and complement what's already been said up, there are 2 reasons why Brexit isn't done, I think. The first is that we haven't actually achieved a stable equilibrium in our relationship with the European Union. We have the ongoing fight over the protocol. Part of that fight is going to court. Part of it will be fought out in the Joint Committee. Ultimately, if that isn't resolved, that can lead to the EU suspending not only the Trade and Cooperation Agreement, but also 2 out of the 3 chunks of the withdrawal agreement. So actually, curiously enough, 5 years on, no deal is still a possibility. I don't think it's a likelihood, but it's a possibility. The European Parliament, as we see in the chat, hasn't ratified this deal yet. They've postponed their vote to the end of April. I think if the fight over the protocol is going on, they will try and postpone it again, except it needs the British government's approval for provisional implementation to continue. So there's an uncertainty over that. And finally, it's worth stressing how little we're actually talking to the European Union at the moment. One of Michael Gove's last acts in his old job of dealing directly with Šefčovič was to write to him and say, we're not going to put the committee structures in place for the TCA until we resolve the outstanding issues. So those committees don't really exist yet. And bear in mind that because of the UK's attitude to the EU's ambassador in London, people from the UK mission to the European Union are not being given meetings with EU officials now. So to a significant extent, there is no formal relationship. We're well short of jaw-jaw. We might not quite be at war, but there is no, the conversations that you would have thought would be going on just aren't at the moment. The second reason why Brexit isn't done is because we haven't yet dealt, in a sense, with some of the things that Matt was talking about, which is Brexit as a symptom. Brexit will be done when we have delivered on the promise made during the referendum and thereafter about creating a more equal and, as the phrase goes, leveled up country. Brexit will be done when the full implications of leaving the European Union for the devolution settlement in Scotland, in Northern Ireland, and also in Wales have been worked through our system. They're a long way from that yet. My final point, just to round up, is just to come back to what Gavin said. I think, to be honest, there's only one Boris Johnson, which sounds like a song, when it comes to this. And that's for the reason that Matt alluded to, which is that what Boris Johnson did in December 2019 was he basically put together a Leave coalition. On these kinds of value questions, the Tories are very united. On these kinds of value questions, equally, Labour are very, very divided. I suspect that going forward, it's simply too tempting politically to keep picking this scab if you're Boris Johnson and his government, because it puts Labour in a bad position and it keeps your troops happy. I think The government is after a kind of simmering row that is ongoing with the European Union, but a row that falls short of a complete breakdown in relations. At the moment, that looks like quite a difficult balancing act to pull off.
Thank you, Anand. So we're going to move to a conversation between the four of you now. I'm very happy if you want to unmute, the guests want to unmute, the guest speakers want to unmute themselves to have a normal conversation, or simply if you want to raise your hand using the reactions button, you can indicate you want to speak or come in on an issue. I'm going to ask you, Anand, the first question, and that is, do you think that the Theresa May Brexit deal, with its common rule book, appreciation of the need for frictionless trade and a version of the customs union, now looks like a better deal than the one we've ended up with?
Better is a loaded term. I mean, I know the Prime Minister is fond of this phrase, but I'm going to use it too. Brexit's like whack-a-mole, isn't it? In the sense that you can whack the economic dimension, or you can whack the Northern Ireland dimension, and immediately the political dimension comes out. So yes, the economics of the Brexit deal that Theresa May negotiated would probably have been less sort of, there would have been less of a negative economic impact in the short term, because there would have been fewer barriers to trade, and the Northern Ireland problem wouldn't exist. That being said, we'd have been a rule taker, and I remain unconvinced that there would have been the votes in the Commons. If you remember those days when the Commons just voted and voted and voted, and Brexit was the only thing we ever thought about, everyone seemed to act as if you could just get something through once, everything would be sorted. The problem was you didn't need a one-off majority, you needed a stable majority to carry a Brexit outcome through. And I don't think, even if some of those Labour waverers had eventually voted for the Theresa May deal, that stable majority existed to get it over the line, to be honest.
It's perhaps a bit unfair, Gavin, to put you on the spot like this, but hey ho, you had an unenviable job, a task of trying to build that coalition for support. And I know amongst my Labour colleagues, there are a number that still maintain the view that we should have actually supported that one in preference to the one that we've ended up with. What's your view now? You've some distance from it, away from the intensity of those months.
It won't surprise you to know that I definitely think it would have been a better outcome for both of the reasons that Alan said, which is first of all, economically, it would have been less damaging. And in terms of the union, I think there still would have been some issues in relation to Northern Ireland, but they wouldn't have been as acute as they are under this deal. And I think that the real test of Boris Johnson's deal is still to come in terms of what Scotland ultimately decides. The reason Theresa supported the kind of compromise she did is because she is a conviction unionist and was convinced from the time she'd spent in Scotland and Northern Ireland that some kind of compromise was the only way to keep the union together. Whereas other people would argue, well, you can't compromise on this issue. They would say, well, Theresa's deal wasn't a proper Brexit because in certain areas of the economy, we would have been a rule taker. And is completely right on what he said. Her defense was, well, the kinds of rules that we would have been following on detailed product standards, on agri-foods and industrial goods are rules that we're very unlikely to want to change, so we can live with that. But he's quite right to say, you've got these multiple axes and you have to make a choice about where you want to be on each. And ultimately, the reason that the compromise failed is that there were too many people on both sides of the argument who didn't want to compromise. A lot of you, as you know, James, a lot of your Labour colleagues believed there was a chance of getting a second referendum and stopping the whole thing happening. And while that was still a live possibility, they weren't prepared to compromise. And I can remember, I'll just end with this point, but I remember a conversation I had in the run-up to the final vote, the third vote, which was just a vote on the withdrawal agreement. And I was talking to, they'll remain anonymous, but I was talking to one of senior member, former colleague of yours. And I said, you do understand that if we lose this vote, she is going to go. And when she goes, do you think the Conservative Party is going to choose someone more to your taste? Or do you think you're going to end up with somebody who is going to try and ram the deal through Parliament? And if they don't succeed at that, is going to go to the country in a way that she can't, having tried that trick once in 2017. And are you confident Jeremy Corbyn's going to prevail against that person? And they sort of said to me, no, a majority will arise for a second referendum. Don't worry, we'll be able to stop them doing that. Well, history tells the tale.
I'm welling up here, Gavin. That's Thank you. Naomi, please, yeah, and Matthew, I'll come to you with the same question. Thanks.
So on the sort of substantive question of whether May's deal looks better than the one that we've got now, then yes, because what's been negotiated is very unambitious for Britain, and it's a pretty low-level deal. But you know, to explain why organisations like Best for Britain were arguing against the deal that Theresa May was putting forward was because of the threat to kind of hard-won rights and the fact that it would have seen us, as others have said, become a rule taker. And in many ways, that is still going to happen because we are still going to have to follow EU regulations on a whole host of goods in order to have access to that market, except that now it's kind of gift-wrapped in ever more red tape.
Thanks, Naomi. Matthew, I guess if we're going to do it, we need to do it right. And so Johnson's view and deal was to say this comes with benefits that weren't available to us if we took Theresa May's deal, and therefore this is a sort of pure version of the vision. What's your sense of the two versions put in front of Parliament?
Well, I think I mean, I agree with everything that has been said. The issue with May's deal, of course, is that it would have divided the Conservative electorate. It would have led to the fragmentation of British politics, which of course we saw most visibly at the time of the European Parliament elections, where we went from a two-party system into a four-party system, because there was a large element within the Leave electorate that saw May's deal, for various reasons, as being not Brexit, as being some kind of compromise that they felt was unacceptable. And so there were obvious internal party political risks to following that avenue. Boris Johnson's deal did something very different, as we saw most powerfully at the 2019 election, which is it unified the Leave alliance in a way that Theresa May came close to in 2017, but didn't quite push over the line. And this is fundamentally where the Remain camp and the Labour Party, I think, underestimated the importance of political geography. Once you transferred the Leave vote onto parliamentary constituencies, so away from a referendum onto the first past the post system, it handed an insurmountable advantage to somebody who unified the Leave vote. It gave them somewhere around 60 to 65% of all constituencies. And the problem that Remain had is that they had lots of votes, but they were stacked up in a smaller number of places. And so, you know, whatever your personal view of the Johnson deal, what it allowed him to do was unify that Leave electorate, which we actually see now as being very well entrenched. So as we go into this Hartlepool by-election, the first by-election of the Parliament, which of course is in a crunch red wall seat, if the Conservatives take that, which on current polling they certainly have a good chance of doing that, that again I think is evidence of this ongoing realignment that is underway. So I don't personally see how the Conservatives would have survived as an electoral force with a quote-unquote soft Brexit.
Thank you, Matthew. Gavin, how will we count the economic damage from 2020, and how do we attribute any damage done by COVID and that which comes from Brexit?
So I think it's very difficult to disentangle the two, but I think they are very different events. So if you read the Office for Budget Responsibility's economic forecast that accompanied the budget the other week, it's pretty clear about it. The pandemic was an immediate and massive economic shock, wiped out 25% of our economy in 6 weeks. Brexit is a slow puncture. And we still haven't seen the full effect of it. And it's one of the things that will help the government in making its case, that it'll take time for the economic reality to manifest. So if you compare the two on their immediate impact, you know, COVID is a far, far more significant event than Brexit is. But if you look down the line at the long-term economic impact, and obviously people will dispute these figures, I'm well aware from my time in government that economic forecasts are not some kind of neutral thing that everybody just accepts. But the OBR are the people that the Chancellor has chosen to make these forecasts, and they tell us that long term, COVID is likely to leave our economy about 3% smaller than it otherwise would have been, and Brexit is likely to leave our economy about 4% smaller than it otherwise would have been. So I would draw a very clear distinction between the immediate impact where COVID completely dwarfs Brexit and the longer term impact where Brexit is probably a slightly more significant event than COVID.
We did some work with the Social Market Foundation last year at Best for Britain, looking at the double whammy, the impact of a very hard Brexit or no deal Brexit alongside the worst recession in 300 years caused by COVID, to try and disentangle the two issues. I think as we come out of lockdown, it's going to be easier to do that. And of course, the sectors that are hit hardest by COVID are things like travel and tourism and retail, and they are not the same ones hit hardest by Brexit, like chemicals, pharmaceuticals, financial services, and of course, shellfish, as we've been seeing a lot of in the press recently. But having both at the same time has actually unleashed two shocks, which hit a wider range of sectors, and hits manufacturing twice. And what we've heard from some in government has been that, supply chains are so disrupted, it makes little difference. You can't untangle them. But actually, supply chains across UK and the EU have held up pretty well. And the types of disruption just are different. And as Gavin says, that the COVID stuff is hopefully much more temporary, albeit very unpredictable when it happened. But Brexit is that much more permanent increase in costs in the supply chain. So rather than cancelling each other out, all of those additional costs within the supply chain are compounding each other, while worrying about supplier viability. Firms will also have a whole new bunch of sort of admin costs for us to deal with.
Matthew, is the effect of COVID a blowout and Brexit a slow puncture?
I think it's too early to say what the fiscal effect of Brexit is going to be, and I think it's going to be almost impossible to disentangle the economic impact of COVID relative to Brexit. We are in such a whirlwind economically that the effects are slipping into each other, overlaying each other. Not only have we got record levels of debt since the Second World War, but we've also got record levels of saving, household saving, that is going to flood back into the economy. And it's going to be very, very difficult, I think, to disentangle those effects. But there are two key points that I think I'd like to make. One is, I think for the Brexit debate, COVID is going to give Remainers and Leavers their avenue into cognitive dissonance. By that, I mean, in the years ahead, I think Remainers will say if there is any economic disruption, it is primarily because of Brexit. I think COVID will give Leavers cover to be able to essentially say this is wrapped up in the biggest crisis since the Second World War, and so on and so forth. But I think it's also given the UK something that the UK wasn't expecting, and which we've seen through the vaccine design and development and delivery, which is the ability of the UK state to outperform its European neighbours. Now, we can quibble with what might have been possible while we were still in the European Union and so on, but the fact remains that after Brexit, most people assumed the UK would underperform the European Union on almost every dimension. And the benchmarking argument was that the UK would see itself underperforming, would change its mind and revert to the European Union. The benchmarking exercise this time around is the other way. It is clearly the European Union that has been underperforming in developing a response to this crisis. That changes the game from here on. It changes the narrative that Boris Johnson has. It changes the narrative that potentially we have for the case for the Union. And it changes the way that people are thinking about the capacity of the UK state as an independent sovereign state outside of the European Union. And we can all quibble with that, but the public psychology that has seen the UK essentially become a global leader in the vaccine development is, I think, going to have a profound political impact on the years ahead.
Anand, Gavin wants to come back in off that point. So, and then I'll come to you, Anand, on the same question. Gavin.
I was going to say let Anand go first. Apologies. So I very strongly I disagree with Matthew's first point, and I agree with his second. So let me give you a quick example. One way I think medium term you are going to be able to see the impact is the trade figures. We had the January figures. You can't really read much into them because you don't know how much that was due to stockpiling. But in a few months' time, we will be able to see what has happened to UK imports and exports from the EU compared with other countries' impact on imports and exports. So you'll be able to strip out a COVID effect and you'll be able to see what the Brexit effect is. On his second point, it might surprise him, but I broadly agree with him. I think that if we had stayed in the EU, we could have ordered our own vaccine contracts. We could have authorised at our own speed, but I don't think we would have. I think we would have gone along with the EU collective view. So I think that is a powerful illustration of an advantage of leaving. And actually, I was very impressed with a quote I saw from an anonymous Commission official who said, is it true that sometimes one country on its own can move more swiftly to its advantage? Definitely yes. Is it also true that sometimes working together with other countries in a group of 27 gives you better options in the world? Definitely yes. And those are the pros and cons of this debate. And I think a fair assessment of COVID would be in the first year, on response to the immediate crisis, the UK fared worse than nearly every European nation. But on vaccine, it has fared much better and showed the advantages of regulatory autonomy in terms of being able to approve the vaccine first and do our own orders.
Thank you, Gavin. Anand.
And it's worth saying briefly that actually being the first to emerge from lockdown conveys a significant economic advantage, not least because you might end up attracting investment that might have gone elsewhere, but if they're still in lockdown, it won't. So I mean, there's a big economic element to the success of the vaccine rollout as well. But just on the point about the economics, I mean, I find myself uncomfortably sort of agreeing with everyone in the sense that I think Gavin and Naomi are right on the empirical picture, but I think Matt's right on the politics, because of course the two defining features of a slow puncture is it takes you absolutely ages to notice you've got one, and by the time you've noticed you've got one, you can no longer remember when you got it. So actually, yes, the Brexit impact is going to be significant. Whether it's going to be massively politically salient, as this is growth foregone rather than growth lost, it's quite a subtle impact. And because the government has arranged things in such a way that we're not putting in place the checks on goods coming in, so what you won't get in GB are the shortages you see in NI. I mean, that's smart politics. It might be rubbish economics, but it's smart politics. I mean, if I were an exporter, I'd be doing my nut because importers get a free ride while I'm getting shafted with all the checks. But politically, it makes absolute sense. So I wonder, I mean, it's obviously a big gamble, but I wonder whether actually the economics of Brexit will have a political impact at all. We're going to have to wait and see, but I'm not convinced. I'll leave it at that. I think academically or econometrically, you can probably do this in 10 or 15 years' time when no one will care anymore. When you've got, a decade's worth of data and you can compare trade figures for us and the European Union, and if there's a difference, you can probably attribute it to a Brexit effect. But I think doing this in a meaningful way before that is just simply impossible because it's too complicated and there are too many variables for, I think, any economist to want to try and undertake it.
Thank you, Anand. So Simon Goldie asks, questions have just gone up. Simon Goldie asks, if realignment is happening, political realignment is happening, what will the political parties look like once it has worked its way through the system? Naomi, do you want to have a first run at that, please?
Yeah, sure. So I think where the Conservatives have been much cleverer than the opposition parties have been is in understanding that the electorate is recalibrated around an internationalist, nationalist, open, closed, liberal, illiberal axis rather than the old traditional left-right. And so what we've seen with this government in particular has been them remaining socially conservative, but becoming much less laissez-faire on economics than the traditional association you would make with the Conservative Party. And that is because they are courting a Leave voter. And a Leave voter tends to be much more socially conservative, but less laissez-faire when it comes to economics. And that creates a real difficulty for the Labour Party, and one that I don't think they've yet really caught up with. There is an enormous amount of effort within the Labour Party around the red wall, those switch voters, that left the Labour Party and went to the Conservative Party at the last election. And I think I have a few concerns for the Labour Party in that regard, because when we're looking at the demographic shifts in those seats, they really are quite stark. A lot of those areas, as James will know all too well, a lot of them are deindustrialised areas that had been failed by successive governments of all shades in terms of their, socio-economic policies. What you've now got is a much older voter in that kind of area. And what I think Labour really ought to be doing is to be looking at the Central Belt in Scotland much more, and rather than favouring the red wall over the tartan wall, I think that they really need to be looking at Scotland again. And they need to be looking at seats like Canterbury that Rosie Duffield holds, and thinking about, well, where are the other Canterburys? Where are those other seats where actually new Labour voters could come from? Because otherwise I think they're in trouble of continuing to fight a left-right issue, which now actually is no longer there in much the same way as it was previously. The swing that a Keir Starmer-led party would need in order to win is larger than that achieved by Blair in '97, and that's before boundary changes will have gone through and before the situation in Scotland unfolds and whether or not we get an independent Scotland. So at the moment I think that's difficult. Obviously we've got the Hartlepool by-election happening. Typically you would expect at this point in the electoral cycle within the parliamentary term that we're in for a government party to be unlikely to win that, particularly having overseen the worst recession in the G7, the worst death rate in Europe, one of the highest death rates in the world. But I think if Labour have got any hope of holding that seat, they really want to hope that Richard Tice stands again there. He had a very sizable share of the vote at the 2019 general election. But if Reform UK do what Brexit Party did, do what UKIP did in 2017 and help out their fellow Eurosceptics and don't stand, I think it would be incredibly difficult for Labour to hold that seat. And what does that then mean? And what lessons will Labour learn? Will they learn the right ones or the wrong ones from that? I've said enough. I'll let somebody else come in.
Thank you, Naomi. Anand, what do you make of that?
Sorry, I'm new to this online world. Just a couple of things to say. I mean, firstly, curiously enough, I still think both parties have to make some rather difficult decisions about who they represent and who they are for, because that's not entirely clear. Do Labour really want to be the party just of metropolitan areas? Because it means they'll never be in power again. And if the Tories genuinely want to be the party of the Shires and the Red Wall, that poses them some really interesting dilemmas when it comes to economic policy. I mean, God help the Chancellor who's got to come out with budgets to reconcile those two constituencies going forward. That's going to be really hard. And this new division is there and it's real, but I think it's too soon to say it's going to dominate for the foreseeable future, because over the course of the next 6 months, I think our politics will change profoundly, because we'll come out of the public health crisis and we'll enter the post-lockdown economic crisis. And if that crisis is accompanied by a massive rise in unemployment, which is possible, we don't know yet. But if that is one of the impacts of the exit from lockdown and of the end of furlough, I suspect that traditional sort of left-right divide in politics will start to become more prominent again. And actually, I think one of the key battles of this parliament is over the political terrain. Keir Starmer wants to be talking left-right. I suspect Boris Johnson wants to be talking social values. And the economic outcome of the pandemic and how well the Chancellor manages it is going to be key to which of them succeeds, I think.
Thank you, Anand. Matthew, you've written extensively on this realignment. Perhaps you can answer the substantive question, but maybe with a looking at the Labour Party leadership now facing the Hartlepool, what your predictions are, whether you're ready to make a prediction about the Hartlepool by-election.
Well, just on Labour's problems first, I put my cards on the table. I don't think there's any way that Labour can win the next election. I think we are looking at a prolonged period of dominance for the Conservative Party. The areas that Naomi points to, university towns, big cities, there aren't enough of them. Labour already control the vast majority of them. There's not enough new territory for the Labour Party to recoup the amount of ground that it needs. The Labour Party is looking vulnerable in Wales, and it needs to ultimately win back England. outside of the big cities and university towns. And here's one statistic to keep in mind, the Labour Party has not won the popular vote in England since 2001. There's a real disconnect that we can all see, we can all sense between the working class and the Labour Party, and that's been compounded, unfortunately, by the way in which those same groups are now completely absent, really, in the Labour membership and the Labour Parliamentary Party. The Labour Party has more university degree holders than the Conservative Party. The biggest tribe within the Labour Parliamentary Party now are political careerists who have spent their lives in politics, and that's not to be disparaging of those individuals, but it is to say that the picture of the Labour Party that is going out externally is fundamentally different from the picture of the Labour Party that went out even as recently as 1997, which is exacerbating their disconnect from those groups, while the Conservative Party is actually becoming more representative in the sense of 2019, for example, having a record number of Conservative MPs from comprehensive state school backgrounds, and those Northern Conservative MPs, I think, broadly being on board with the economic outlook of many of these voters, you know, wanting to do more around levelling up and wanting to take a tougher line on some of these issues. I would push back against Naomi a little bit. This is not about liberalism versus illiberalism. Most of the voters who have sided with Johnson, and also most Brexiteers, accept many of the changes that have taken place in British society. Rights for women, same-sex couples, they are broadly liberal defined, and it's not open-closed, it's fast versus slow. They would rather slow the pace of social change, of economic change, of demographic change. They don't want to end it completely. So, for example, if you look at their attitudes on Hong Kongers arriving to the UK, or you look at their attitudes towards migration since Brexit, actually they've become more positive, more accommodating, but certainly not saying, you know, let's throw everybody out of the country and go back to 1950. That's not the view. And I think those sometimes on the Remain side, I think, have amplified their political problems by pushing some of those narratives. And just very lastly on Hartlepool, if the Conservatives win Hartlepool, that to me is good evidence that not only is the realignment still underway, but something that I noticed the Labour Party haven't quite picked up on yet, which is that the Red Wall still has quite a long way to go. There are still about 30 seats that have gone from being safe Labour seats to being marginal Labour seats, which is something to keep in mind for the next election. So Labour could win back some of the Red Wall, but they could lose a whole nother chunk of the Red Wall that we need to keep in mind. And the second key point, and Naomi alluded to this, is that, you know, we know Labour have lost 2 Red Walls. Labour's also lost Scotland, and so far there is very little evidence that Labour's recouping that ground in Scotland, and that's going to leave it really with nowhere to go. Whereas the Conservatives, I think, can still eat into Wales, they can still eat into the Red Wall, and they can still do that by talking up these cultural questions.
Thank you, Matthew.
Very quickly.
Very quickly, yeah, very quickly, right to reply.
Yeah. Just to say that, of course, you know, this government didn't win the popular vote either, and it did benefit from this alliance of the Leave coalition, if you like, by Farage standing down so many candidates. At Best of Britain, we did some analysis on polling that the Sunday Times published in January that showed that actually Labour was set to win back a fair chunk of the Red Wall, as Matthew alluded to. There are some marginal seats there for them. We did some packed analysis on that at Best of Britain to understand, okay, well, what happens if Reform Party stands down again? And yes, you see a reversal of that. But if Labour was to stand down in just a dozen seats for the Liberal Democrats, they could set to win up to 100 seats and take a 320+1 majority to get the keys to number 10. So I think the only challenge I would have to what Matthew was saying is, under a first past the post system, if Labour can't do a pact on their side in much the same way as Farage and Johnson did at the last election, then they can't win, but they could if they did.
Thank you. I'm going to bring Leon Cook in, the founder of Atticus Communications, who's got a question.
Thank you, James. It sounds like the short form answer to the exam question of is Brexit done? Far from it. So, and over the course of the next number of months and years, the impact on Northern Ireland, protocol question, the union, trade, and the political fortunes of various parties will remain to be seen. I think politics is always governed by numbers. It's the last thing that people hear or read. and whether that would be free school meals or what happens on NHS pay. I think the vaccine question and the rollout has absolutely had a massive impact, in my view, on how people see Brexit now. So my question is to all of the panelists, but specifically the academics. If the 2016 poll was to be run today, what would be the result and what would be the number split? Starting with Anand.
Oh God, I don't know. What I would say is if you dig into the numbers, there are a couple of interesting things, and let's see if I say these interesting things out loud, if it moves me towards an answer to your question or not. The first is, yes, there has been a shift in that YouGov polling saying wrong decision, right decision, and there's now a gap in favour of right decision, which I think is larger than it's ever been. But much of that is made up of changing demographics rather than people changing their mind. That's to say, a lot of it is made up of the fact that people are now being asked who were too young to vote in 2016. And of course, the young are disproportionately pro-Remain. And so they're saying it's a wrong decision. Also, there's been some survey work sort of addressing this, saying to people who think it was a wrong idea, do we think we should have left? And a surprising number of them have said yes. So just because you think it's the wrong decision doesn't mean you don't think we should have left, because we had a referendum and it voted to leave. So I still think if we had a referendum, Remain might edge it, but it would be much, much closer, I think, than those kind of headline YouGov figures would suggest.
Who'd like to have a go at that?
Come on, Matthew.
So if you ask in hindsight, was it right or wrong, people tend to say it was the wrong decision to leave. But then if you say, would you rejoin? Should we stay as we are or rejoin? They tend to say we should stay. But obviously this is all completely speculative based on an event that, you know, may not happen. The fundamental shift that we saw in public opinion, just so I think people may find it interesting. In 2017, Corbyn was holding a large number of voters that we'd call cross-pressured, that agreed with the Conservatives on Brexit, but they agreed with Corbyn on the economy. And essentially what happened is the pivot to a second referendum within the Labour Party sent those specific voters, the cross-pressured voters, into Boris Johnson's arms in droves. They noticed the second referendum switch within the Labour Party, and that pushed them into Johnson's arms. So I think there was an opportunity, obviously, to get a deal, a softer deal, but it really was that push for a second referendum, which has clear implications for the future. We're not seeing 18 to 24-year-olds clamoring for a second referendum. The salience of the issue across all groups, as somebody alluded to earlier on, is collapsing. The Zoomers, Generation Z, are much more interested in climate change than they are the European Union. And you can already see, I think, how the Conservatives are positioning on the environment in a way that you know is going to dilute the case for Remain being a sort of, you know, pro-climate type case. So I don't think we are going to be having a referendum or rejoining in the 2020s. Longer term, who knows? But I don't think it's going to happen in the short term.
Just on that, in the spirit of trying to get some more questions in related, this question from Paul Brooks may be slightly partisan, Paul, but you've asked it, so I will share it. Will the next election be influenced by any of the dishonesty and lack of integrity of the Conservative Prime Minister, shall we say, as opposed to all Conservatives, which I don't share that view. But who would like to fold that into the question of the realignment that Leon asked?
Shall I have a go? Because I didn't come in on the original alignment question. So if I try and wrap the three together, I think if there was a referendum tomorrow, I don't think the result would be much different. And I say that, you know, the polls, as people say, when you ask the question, it kind of depends how you phrase it. I think all of us, if we think of our personal lives, who do we know who's changed their mind? I can't think of many people I know who've changed their minds. On the sort of, on Paul's question, I mean, yes, in the sense that some people will agree with Paul's characterization of the Prime Minister, so that will motivate how they vote. But I don't think it will be decisive. If you look at the polls at the moment, that clearly isn't the majority view. It's a slightly ironic thing for me to say, given I've devoted most of my life to party politics, but I'm less interested in it now than getting the policy right. Matthew actually came to see me when I was Theresa's chief of staff and made the argument that he's just made about the realignment that he thought was happening. And if it endorses his case at all, I agree with him, even though I don't like it. From my personal perspective, it isn't a welcome thing because it leaves me feeling slightly politically homeless. But I think it's not just something that's happening in this country. As he said, it feels like it's a phenomenon across most of the democratic world. And my final thought on that would be, one of the issues for Labour is it isn't really trying to make the transition. The Conservatives have positively adopted the transition. So if Labour wanted to turn itself into a sort of Romani university-educated party that would be very different from its historical roots, there are seats in London and the southeast of England, in the outskirts of London and the southeast of England, that such a party could win. But it doesn't want to do that because, and James, you're probably better qualified than me to comment on that, but it would feel like, if you just think of the name of the Labour Party, it was originally the party for organised Labour. So it would be a fundamental change to what Labour members, I think, would feel the Labour Party was for. So in a way, the reason you've got an unequal battle at the moment is that the Conservative Party has adopted Matthew's thesis wholesale and is running with it, and the other side isn't even trying. And as Naomi said, the only way I think that you could see an outcome other than a Conservative victory at the next election, absent some major event that throws politics up in the air, is Naomi's suggestion about some kind of collaboration between the Lib Dems and the Greens and Labour, because at the last election, essentially the Leave coalition was united behind the Conservative Party and the Remain coalition was completely fractured. So you get the result you get.
Do we think there is a serious appetite for a progressive alliance, Anand?
No, I think political tribalism, which we saw when Gavin was trying to get the withdrawal bill through, political tribalism remains as strong as ever. I just don't see the kind of appetite for that in the Labour Party at the moment, to be honest.
We're nearing the end. We've got about 4 more minutes. I'm going to ask another question I've received. Now we've left the EU, is immigration in Britain more or less of a political issue?
I can go first if you like. So this polling question is really fascinating, and when you look at that sort of question, sentiment towards immigration going back to sort of 97, I think Ipsos Mori are probably one of the best pollsters at having done the longitudinal study on this. Immigration wasn't ranking as a top issue. And then, you fast forward to the elections of the 2010s and it clearly had ratcheted up. And what had happened in that time? Well, we had not built enough homes. Gavin's a former housing minister. He knows all too well about the need for us to massively increase the supply of new homes in this country, in order of at least 300,000 a year. And that's just to sort of play catch up. We have not had an approach to immigration that the likes of Canada has had, who have done it very successfully and have taken a very interventionist approach to helping communities absorb migration, helping immigrants to learn languages and big investment in making them a much more seamless fit into an existing community than we've had. And it's been comforting for those of us who are, proudly in favour of immigration and immigration and all the grations. It's a wonderful thing, and I mourn the loss of freedom of movement. To see that sentiment against immigration has been falling. I therefore think it's unlikely to be as big a totemic issue as it was. I am, very pleased and heartened to see how welcoming, at least in polling questions, British public seem to be towards the potential for lots of Hong Kongese to move here. So I expect that it probably won't be the big issue, but nonetheless, that doesn't mean that we've resolved the issues that led to the anti-immigration sentiment that we had in the last few elections. No,
quite right. Matthew, you've written that in fact immigration is more positively accepted since Brexit. I think you wrote that in January of last year. What's your sense now?
I think there are two things that potentially are colliding. I think one is, without question, the British public have become more positive and relaxed about immigration. I think that's partly related to Remainers becoming much more positive since the referendum as an affirmation of their social liberalism. But it's also Leavers becoming more relaxed about the issue because they feel that they have control. Now, if we revert to net migration levels throughout the 2020s of 300k plus, I think there will come a tension point for Boris Johnson with his electorate about, you know, what that means and whether that's what Leavers were expecting. Let's kind of leave that hanging there. I think the risk, again, for the Labour Party is that that is now colliding with a view not held by all Remainers or all Liberals, but there is a loud, vocal group within the Liberal camp, a more progressive group, which More in Common have pointed to in their research, which is absolutely adamant and convinced of the view that Britain is a racist, intolerant country. And that is linked to a particular worldview within the history of progressive liberalism. And it comes with some big risks for our politics because it is sending a very loud message to Leavers who are actually becoming more liberal over time. There is another fairly vocal faction that views them as being, you know, illiberal, xenophobic, racist, wrapped by white privilege, institutional racism, etc. That is actually going to feed the realignment over the longer term, and I think points to the need for moderates on all sides, Leavers and Remainers, to stand up to these minority views and say, actually, there's lots of good things happening in Britain today. This is something I try and do, and it's hard to do, but there are lots of good things happening in Britain today. We need to focus on those good things and push back against these caricatures that we have within minority camps on both sides.
Thank you, Matthew. I'm going to ask you each to finish with a sort of 30 seconds, a minute summary or final thoughts. By all means, incorporate some of the questions that you've heard. And it prompted really to answer the question posed by former Member of Parliament Neil Carmichael on the chat. And that is, what kind of Europe will emerge without the membership of the UK in the EU? And perhaps you could fold that into your summary of thoughts from today's session. And we will begin with Anand, please.
Well, let me just address Neil's question directly. I think a weaker European Union, because it'll be smaller economically, it'll be less powerful militarily and diplomatically, but a European Union in a sense that isn't that structurally different to the European Union when the United Kingdom was in. There are some things the EU can do now that it probably wouldn't have been able to do if we'd been in. The Recovery Fund, I think, is a really good example of that. I don't see the Recovery Fund in its present form being passable with a British government, either Labour or Conservative, I should say, round the table. It wouldn't have happened in the form it did. But apart from that, you know, no one else is going to emulate us and leave the European Union in the foreseeable future, but nor is the European Union now free to move forward towards federation without the pesky Brits around the table, because all the structural problems it faced when we were in, Eurozone reform, migration, East versus West, liberalism versus illiberalism, still exist and still evade solutions. So I think the EU will continue to muddle on, slightly smaller, a tiny bit more efficient in some areas.
Matthew.
I think in a strange way, I agree with everything Anand said, but I think also the European Union is going to become a lot more unified in the short term. We've seen a real Brexit bounce. Support for membership of the European Union has increased in most EU member states. There's a real rallying around the flag effect that we've seen in European Union. Longer term, I'm much less optimistic, and I think one of the risks with COVID, not only in terms of on our side exacerbating some of the economic risks that Gavin has alluded to with Brexit, but COVID is also likely to exacerbate the divergence story within the European Union. The Recovery Fund, in my view, is nowhere near enough. The US has thrown $4 trillion at its recovery. We've thrown, I don't know where we are now, some 400 or billion, something like that. But the entire European Union so far has committed about 700 billion. I think we're going to see that divergent story become much more acute as we go through the 2020s, with the southern periphery countries, particularly Spain and Italy, moving further away from the northern, less indebted states. And I think that's going to become, again, within the context of benchmarking, a really big problem for the European Union.
That's in addition to national programmes, Matt.
Yeah, but it's still nowhere near enough.
No, but what I'm saying is that's not the only amount, because national governments have funded recovery as well. So it's a sort of, I agree, it's not enough, but it's not the sum total that's been.
Yeah, sure.
Yeah, all right.
Naomi, please.
Well, I mean, I don't want to bore the audience. I agree with much of that. Yes, we've seen, as Matthew said, record sort of support for the European Union from within its remaining member states, huge amounts of pressures on them. I think what we do know is that globally, there is an increasing trend for more regional integration, certainly economically. So I do hope that, here in Britain, and I run an organisation called Best for Britain, not Best for the EU, that we revisit the TCA and have over time much better, genuinely much more frictionless trade between us, because it will be to the benefit of both our neighbours and allies and friends in Europe and Britain as well.
Gavin, could I ask you to close proceedings and give us your final thoughts on, in answer to Neil's question, and any broader point you wish to make, please?
Thanks, James. Yeah, really good discussion. Two quick final points from me. I think on Neil's question, I'd just flag up two extra things. I think the rule of law dispute is the biggest issue internally within the EU, where they go with Orban in particular, but Poland to a lesser extent. I also think if you rephrase Neil's question slightly, what kind of Europe will emerge after the German federal elections in September when Merkel goes, that will be a very significant change and significant moment. And I'll just end by picking up on Matthew's answer to the previous question, which I thought was really interesting and like personally exemplifies how I find myself sort of stuck in the middle. Because to me, it is perfectly possible to simultaneously believe that there are lots of good things about this country, that the experience of most people from Black and minority ethnic backgrounds is that they do experience some racism, but that doesn't make the country racist or all Leave voters racist, and that actually most of us are not in a great position to comment about how racist the country is because we don't experience it. So it's the answer to me sort of exemplified how these cultural wars tend to polarize and try and place people in one camp or another, and maybe truth lies somewhere in between.
Truth lies somewhere in between. That's a good lesson. Can I thank you all for joining? Those of you still with us, and everybody that's joined this discussion today, and especially our speakers, Right Honourable Gavin Barwell, Professor Matthew Goodwin, Naomi Smith, Chief Exec of Best for Britain, and Professor Anand Menon. I have really enjoyed catching up and opening up old wounds, picking the scab, I think it was described as at the outset. And please do keep a lookout for future webinars, future podcasts. We have another podcast we're recording on Monday with Dan Jarvis, the Mayor of South Yorkshire. We've got a Chair of Select Committee podcast forthcoming as well. But please do keep your eyes peeled for future events, and do share the link when we post the link of today's recording and healthy debate. Once again, thanks ever so much to the speakers, Gavin, Matthew, Naomi and Anand. It's been terrific to see you all and listen to you all today, and so respectfully as well. We have at least moved on from the air of toxicity that the Brexit debate used to have, I think, and that was a very constructive, very stimulating debate. So thank you all. And from Atticus Communications, over and out. Thank you.
Thank you.